The test was sitting on the bathroom counter, like someone had placed it there deliberately. Michael Carter had only gone in to grab his razor. 10:30 on a Tuesday. The Colonial on Birchwood Drive was quiet in the particular way it had been quiet for months. Not peacefully, but carefully. The way a house goes quiet when the people inside it have agreed, without ever saying so, to stop asking certain questions. He picked it up with 2 fingers, the way you'd handle something already contaminated. He turned it once. The lines were faint, but they were there. He didn't call out. He didn't go to Laura. He didn't give himself 30 seconds to think. He walked downstairs with the test in his hand and the verdict already written. He passed Ryan in the dining room. Ryan still had his wine. He passed the kitchen. He stopped in the living room doorway where Ava was curled on the couch reading, and he held out his hand and said nothing and let the object speak. Ava looked up. She saw what he was holding, and the color didn't drain from her face. It vanished, instantly and completely, the way it does in people who have spent a long time waiting for something terrible to arrive. "Dad." "What is this, Ava?" Not a question. The period was already there. The room reorganized. Laura materialized from the hallway. Ryan had gone very still in the dining room. Not alarmed still, not the stillness of someone blindsided, something more considered than that. Ava sat upright. She looked at the test. She looked at her father's face and found nothing there that was waiting to hear her out. And then, for barely a second, less than a breath, in the specific way that certain looks contain years of unsaid things, her eyes moved to Ryan. Ryan looked away. He reached for his wine. Michael watched all of it. And in the space between one glance and the next, he decided he already had everything he needed. "Get out of my house." He said it quietly. That was the part nobody who heard the story later could quite believe. That it wasn't shouted, wasn't raged into existence. Just said, calmly. The tone of a man closing an account. Ava didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't ask him to wait. That silence, her silence, was the thing that would stay with everyone longest. She went upstairs. She came back down 4 minutes later with a duffel bag. No photographs, no extra shoes. The bag of someone who had long ago learned to travel light inside this house. She paused at the door. Michael did not look at her. The door closed. And Ryan poured himself more wine. To understand what happened to Ava Carter, you have to understand what the Carter family looked like from the outside. Because the outside was the version that mattered most to Michael. The version he had spent 20 years curating, protecting, and choosing over every uncomfortable alternative. He ran a civil engineering firm, respected, financially solid. He coached Little League until the neighborhood kids aged out. He shook hands like he meant it. He remembered the names of spouses and children at every dinner party, every church fundraiser, every school event that Ava had quietly stopped attending by the time she was 19. Nobody asked why she stopped. Michael told people she was figuring herself out, and said it with a warmth that made the phrase sound like generosity rather than dismissal. The house on Birchwood Drive was always clean. The curated kind of clean, not sterile, but intentional. Every surface suggested a family that had things together. That was largely Laura's work. 18 years of quietly intercepting roughness before it could reach the surface. Smoothing, redirecting, choosing the version of events least likely to need a conversation. Ava was their only child. Quiet, people said, and then, because quiet in a young woman needs softening, they added, but very sharp. She'd gone to college 2 states away. She'd come back at 22 after a final semester that nobody fully explained. Michael said it had been a hard year, in a tone that discouraged follow-up. She moved back into her childhood bedroom without much ceremony and moved through the house, people noticed, like someone calculating how much space it was acceptable to occupy. Then there was Ryan, Michael's younger brother by 6 years. Never quite settled, not in career, relationship, or city, but charming. Genuinely, fluently charming. The kind of charming that feels like a gift being extended to you specifically. He'd been at Birchwood Drive more and more over the past 8 months. A rough patch, he told Michael. In between things. Michael always had room for family. He was proud of that. What nobody outside the house saw clearly, Ryan did not simply visit the Carters. He installed himself in them, He learned the rhythms. He brought wine on Fridays and made Michael laugh with stories from their childhood, and told Laura her pot roast was better than their mother's. He understood, with precise and intuitive accuracy, what Michael Carter needed from the people around him: ease, agreement, and no hard questions. Ava had started eating alone in her room when Ryan was home. Michael noticed. He told himself she was being difficult. He actually believed that. And Ryan, who noticed too, who had always noticed everything about Ava's movements in the house, said nothing. He simply turned up the warmth toward Michael by exactly the degree that Ava turned it down. He was very, very good at math like that. Slow it down, because this is where 1 second became permanent. Michael in the doorway. The test extended like an accusation that has already stopped being a question. Ava upright on the couch, something moving behind her eyes that looked like a woman running rapidly through every possible answer and finding that none of them could survive the room she was in. Laura pressed her palm flat against the hallway wall. Ryan's wine sat untouched. "Tell me it isn't what I think it is." Ava opened her mouth. What was she supposed to say? That the test was old? That she didn't know where it came from? That the real story was more complicated than this moment could hold? That it involved months of things she'd tried to say and couldn't? That the person sitting quietly in the next room was not the innocent bystander he appeared to be? How do you compress all of that into one breath under a father's stare that has already stopped waiting? She didn't speak fast enough. Who? One syllable, and Ava, under the full weight of her father's certainty, under her mother's paralysis, under 8 months of something she had never found the exact language for, looked at Ryan. Here's what that look was not. It was not a confession. It was not the admission Michael would spend weeks insisting it had been. It was the look of someone watching the only other person in the room who had relevant information decide, in real time, to keep it. It was the look of a woman running one final test on the man she had been afraid to confront directly. Ryan picked up his wine glass, set it back down, looked at the table. And Michael Carter, who had built his entire identity on being the kind of man who could read a room, read it catastrophically wrong. Not because the evidence was convincing, because the conclusion was one he'd already been building toward for a long time. He had needed it to be true. That's the thing nobody in the family wanted to understand afterward. He didn't give her the sentence, just the verdict. Get out. Ava stood. No argument, no plea, no tearful bargaining or desperate reaching for his arm. She just stood. And the absence of protest was the most damning thing in the room, because Michael read it as guilt, and Laura read it as resignation. And the only person who might have read it correctly, as the response of someone who had understood the outcome long before this night, said nothing at all. Laura said her name, once, barely above a whisper, the sound a person makes when they want to appear to have tried. Ryan said, "Michael, maybe just," and stopped. Maybe just what? That sentence has never been finished, and everyone who heard about it later tried to complete it in their own heads. Maybe just hear her out. Maybe just wait a minute. Maybe just ask one question before you destroy your daughter's life in your own living room. Ryan never got to the second half because Michael looked at him, not with fury, but with something colder, a look that said, "You have no standing here." And Ryan recognized the exit and took it. He settled back. He let the silence be his answer. Ava came back downstairs in 4 minutes. Duffel bag. The bare minimum. Not because she was rushing, because she understood, in the ancient way of people who have learned not to expect much, that asking for more time would accomplish nothing. She stopped at the door. 1 second, maybe 2. Michael looked at the wall. She left. Laura would later say she still heard that door closing at random moments, waking at 3 in the morning, sitting in a grocery store parking lot with the engine off. The sound had embedded itself somewhere she couldn't reach. Ryan picked up his wine, found it had gone warm, drank it anyway. The story didn't wait for Ava to reach the end of the block. This is the specific cruelty of communities built on reputation. They don't spread rumors out of malice, most of them. They spread them because a narrative vacuum is genuinely uncomfortable, and an outline already this suggestive fills itself. Ava Carter, 22. Came home from college under circumstances nobody had properly explained. Quiet, withdrawn, and now this. Michael didn't make announcements. He didn't need to. He told two people a careful, partial version of events, that Ava had done something that violated the family's trust, that he'd had no choice, that it broke his heart to do what he had to do. He said the last part with the particular gravity of a man who needs his pain on the record. He believed he was being restrained. He was building the walls of her cage. The specifics filled themselves in from there. A relative called Laura who cried and said she couldn't talk about it, which landed as confession. Ryan mentioned to a cousin that Michael was shattered. A neighbor who'd seen the duffel bag told 3 women over coffee what she thought she'd figured out. Within a week, Ava Carter was a story. She was discussed by people who had met her twice. Ryan, notably, told no one she was innocent. He expressed devastation on Michael's behalf. He was very good at that kind of devastation, the second-hand kind that costs nothing and lands perfectly. Noah Bennett heard the story at a bar, fourth-hand and already distorted. Noah had known Ava since they were 12 years old. He'd sat next to her in 7th grade math. He'd watched her navigate that house from the outside for years. And the version of Ava in the story, reckless, dishonest, disloyal, didn't match a single memory he had of her. Not one. He texted her the same night. She didn't respond for 4 days. When she did, she wrote, "I'm okay. I just can't talk about it yet." Noah read that 3 times. Then he saved it. Not as evidence of anything he could name, just because it sounded to him like someone who had expected not to be reached for. The test had been thrown away the same night. Michael dropped it in the kitchen trash like something diseased, went to bed, and did not sleep. He lay in the dark next to Laura, who also did not sleep, and neither of them spoke, because they had reached the arrangement many couples reach, slowly, without ever discussing it, where the things most dangerous to the household are the things least likely to be named aloud. He didn't sleep, but he didn't waver either. That was the detail that mattered. He revisited the scene in his head, the test, the pale face, the look, the silence, and each time he played it, it confirmed what he'd already concluded. He had spent 2 decades trusting his read of a room. He was respected for it professionally. He had simply never considered the possibility that the very confidence he was most proud of was the exact thing most likely to destroy someone he was supposed to protect. Ryan left Birchwood Drive 9 days after Ava, a business opportunity, he said, with the energy of a man surprised by good news, something that had come up unexpectedly. He had booked the flight 4 days after Ava walked out. Laura found the search history by accident. She didn't bring it up, but she noticed something else. Something she turned over for weeks before she could articulate it. When Ryan left, he didn't look relieved to be escaping a difficult household. He looked relieved in the more specific way of someone who had been waiting for a particular moment and had just confirmed it had passed. Laura filed it in the drawer in her mind where she kept things she didn't know how to use yet. That drawer was getting full. Noah drove 3 hours without calling ahead. He found Ava in a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like takeout containers and cheap candles burned against air that felt wrong. She was wearing an old sweatshirt he recognized from high school. She'd lost weight she hadn't had to lose. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, but the faint, careful adjustment of someone who had quietly stopped expecting people to show up and was now recalibrating. "You actually came," she said. The way she said it was the first thing that told him everything. He asked for the truth. All of it. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Even if no one will believe it?" He said yes. What she told him was incomplete, Not because she was lying, but because some of it she still didn't have language for. The details that were concrete, though, were deeply strange. She hadn't taken the test recently. She'd found it in the back of the bathroom cabinet, already opened, shoved behind a box of bandages. She didn't know how long it had been there. She hadn't been to a doctor. Noah pulled out his phone. "Ava, expired pregnancy tests can give false positives. So can certain medications, certain medical conditions." She stared at him. "You haven't seen a doctor." She shook her head. The silence between them was a different kind than the silences at Birchwood Drive. This one wasn't loaded with judgment. It was loaded with the dawning recognition of how quickly one piece of plastic had been used to write a verdict, and how many questions a man who claimed to love his daughter had never once thought to ask. "Who do you think left that test in the cabinet?" Noah said. Ava didn't answer right away, but the way she didn't answer told him she'd already been thinking about it. Ava was not pregnant. She had never been pregnant. The clinic was 30 minutes from her apartment. Fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, a doctor who delivered the result with professional neutrality and no awareness of what it would mean. Blood test. Unambiguous. Noah was sitting next to her. He looked at her when the doctor finished speaking, expecting something, relief or vindication, or the release of tears that had been waiting. She wasn't surprised. That was what fractured him, not the result itself, her reaction to it. She received it the way someone receives news they had already grief processed, quietly, with the exhaustion of a person who had predicted the outcome and finds no satisfaction in being right. He called Michael from the parking lot while Ava waited inside. Michael picked up on the second ring. Noah told him, clearly, calmly, without editorializing. Michael said almost nothing. Then, "I see. Then, I'll need some time." Noah sat in his car for 20 minutes after that call ended. He didn't start the engine. He kept thinking about those two words, "I'll need some time." The phrasing of a man processing an inconvenience, not the phrasing of a man who had just been told he expelled his daughter from her home on the basis of a misread object and an assumption so ugly it should have collapsed under its own weight before it ever became an action. Here is what Michael Carter had done. He had found one ambiguous piece of plastic. He had constructed the worst possible narrative from it. He had delivered his verdict in front of witnesses before allowing a single syllable of defense. He had turned away from his daughter at the door. He had spent 9 days telling a careful story to relatives, ensuring they would fill in the worst details themselves. And the pregnancy had never existed. But the exile had. Every hour of it. Every sleepless night in a stranger's apartment. Every unreturned call. Every whispered conversation at every family dinner Ava was not invited to. The test was wrong. His instinct to shame her was not a malfunction. It was a revelation. He didn't make a mistake. He showed you who he was, and the truth just happened to take the mistake away. It took Noah 2 visits and a very long silence before Ava explained the look. They were at a diner near her apartment, a rainy Thursday, coffee going cold between them. She'd been staring at the window for a while. Then she said, without preamble, "I looked at him to see what he'd do." Not an accusation in any form her father would recognize, not a confession, a test. One final, desperate test administered in the only second she had left. She had wanted to see whether 8 months of Ryan watching her become smaller and quieter and more invisible in her own home would finally produce something honest from him. Whether the moment of maximum pressure would crack his composure open and force out the one true sentence he had been declining to say for the better part of a year. It hadn't. What Ryan had been doing was not dramatic. That was exactly how it had survived. He had never raised his voice at Ava, never issued a threat, never done anything that would read from the outside as anything other than a slightly awkward dynamic between a niece and an uncle who didn't quite connect. What he did was quieter, more patient. He told Michael about Ava's bad days, not with alarm, with concern. that gentle, sorrowful concern of a man carrying news he wished he didn't have to. She seemed really low this week. I don't know, Mike, she worries me a little. Drip by drip and dinner by dinner, he reinforced the version of Ava that served him best: volatile, fragile, difficult, unreliable. The version whose perspective a busy, reasonable man didn't need to take too seriously. He was meticulous about it. Because Ryan Carter understood something specific about reputation-driven fathers with more pride than curiosity. They do not investigate what has already been confirmed for them. They receive information from trusted sources and organize their understanding around it. Michael had been organized for months. Ava had tried to name what was wrong. Twice, directly. Once, indirectly. The indirect attempt? She'd mentioned to Laura that Ryan made her uncomfortable being alone in the house with him. Laura had said, with genuine gentleness, "He's going through a lot. Try to give him grace." The first direct attempt, she'd told Michael she wished Ryan didn't stay over as often. Michael had gone quiet. The silence of a man choosing his response. Then said, "He's my brother, Ava. This is still a family home." The second direct attempt ended before it started. She'd opened the sentence, watched her father's face, and closed it. She didn't have the language for what was wrong, because the language requires someone willing to receive it, and she had already tested every available person and gotten her result. The look at Ryan that Tuesday night was the last version of that test, her final attempt to make someone in that room do the right thing. He looked away. She already knew he would. Ryan did not stay silent because he panicked. He stayed silent because silence was the only move that cost him nothing, and Ryan Carter had been playing that specific game for a very long time. Ava had seen something. Ryan was not entirely sure how much, but he knew she had seen enough. 11 months earlier, she had been helping Laura sort through household financial paperwork and had come across a forwarded document she wasn't supposed to see. A property transfer tied to their grandfather's estate. A signature. A number that didn't land in any account Laura knew about. Ava had looked at it for a long time. She hadn't confronted Ryan directly. She was smarter than that, or perhaps just more afraid. But she'd asked a question at a family dinner, casual enough to seem innocent, about the estate, and she had watched Ryan's response with the attention of someone who already suspected the answer. Ryan had seen her watching. He had understood immediately what it meant. He spent the following months ensuring that Ava's credibility inside the household remained as low as possible. Not through cruelty, through performance, compassion. The small, consistent, sympathetic-sounding narrative that Ava was struggling, fragile, difficult, still not quite right since college. The version of a person whose observations a reasonable man was not obligated to take literally. It worked because Michael had wanted it to work. It had required far less effort than it should have. On the night Michael stood in that doorway with the test, Ryan ran the calculation in under 3 seconds. Ava was already implicated. Michael was already decided. The family shame was in motion and looking for a landing place. If Ryan said anything at all, he risked pulling the thread that led back to the estate, the document, the number that wasn't in any account Laura knew about. All he had to do was be still. He was extraordinary at being still. He left 9 days later. Business opportunity. A flight booked 48 hours after Ava walked out, once he was certain the room had fully collapsed around her and there was nothing left to manage. He hugged Michael at the door and said he was proud of him for handling a terrible situation with dignity. Michael shook his hand. Ava, 40 miles away in an apartment that smelled like cheap candles, had not been called. The pregnancy test was never the point. Michael was the last one to understand that. He sat in the house in the weeks after Noah's call. Laura, somewhere nearby, not quite in the same room, not quite in a different one, and tried to identify the specific moment where everything had gone wrong. He kept arriving at Tuesday night, the test, the doorway. He kept treating that as the origin of the damage, because it was easier to believe that a single night of bad judgment could be atoned for than to believe what the alternative implied. Noah disabused him of that eventually. He showed up one afternoon and Michael let him in because he had run out of the energy required to keep people out. They sat in the kitchen. Noah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You didn't throw her out because you thought she was pregnant," Noah said. "You threw her out because you needed her to be guilty. There's a difference." Michael started to respond. "She told your wife Ryan made her uncomfortable. Your wife told her to give him grace." Noah set his coffee down. "She told you she didn't want him staying over. You told her it was a family home. She tried to write you a letter and didn't finish it because she already knew what you'd say. The test didn't create your assumption. It just gave it a shape." Michael said nothing. "She spent almost a year in that house after deciding she wasn't safe with the truth. A year, Michael. And you spent that year letting Ryan explain her to you, never once asking Ava to explain herself." The silence that followed was the kind that cannot be filled. Michael had not simply misread one terrible night. He had spent years constructing the conditions that made the misreading inevitable. His discomfort with Ava's silences, reframed as her attitude. His ease with Ryan, protected because Ryan was simple and comfortable and never required Michael to examine anything. His understanding of fatherhood as provision and authority rather than attention. The slow, difficult, unglamorous attention of someone who bothers to learn what their child is actually afraid of. He had preferred the version of reality that asked nothing of him. And when one expired piece of plastic handed him an exit from the effort of truly seeing his daughter, he had taken it at a run. He had not believed she was guilty. He had been primed for it, groomed over months, then handed the moment. A man who had truly wanted to see his daughter would have asked one question. Just one. He asked none. Laura kept a list in her head. She never wrote it down. Writing it down would have made it real. Real things require responses. And Laura had spent 18 years becoming fluent in the particular skill of keeping things from becoming real enough to require a response. It was not cruelty. It was the survival mechanism of a woman who had built her stability around a man who did not tolerate disruption and had quietly mistaken that stability for love. The list existed anyway. Ryan coming home past midnight and Ava being the only one still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a book she wasn't reading. The bedroom door. Ava had started locking it. That had never happened before. Not once in 22 years. Laura had noticed. She had told herself it was a phase. She had not mentioned it to Michael, because mentioning it would have required explaining why she found it significant. An evening in October when Laura had walked past the kitchen and seen Ryan speaking to Ava in a low voice, close, and Ava had gone absolutely still. The particular stillness of someone managing a situation rather than participating in it. Laura had kept walking. She had chosen, actively and in real time, to keep walking. There was the morning Ava had looked at her across the breakfast table with something in her eyes that Laura had been calling sullenness for 2 years. She couldn't look at it the same way now. It looked different in retrospect, like something behind glass, like a person already on the other side of a window, watching to see if anyone would come. There was the sentence Ava had started once. "Mom, I need you to understand something about Ryan." And Laura had redirected her because Michael had just come home and dinner wasn't finished, and there was never a right moment for that sentence. The reason there was never a right moment was that Laura had never built one. She understood that now with a clarity that felt like its own kind of punishment. She had not been neutral. Neutrality is a story the non-intervening tell themselves to protect their self-image. What Laura had been was complicit in the most ordinary and heartbreaking way. She had chosen the version of peace that required the least from her, and her daughter had paid for it in a currency Laura had not yet found a way to repay. Silence doesn't stay neutral. It moves. It always moves toward whoever is already standing. It had never once stood with Ava. Michael called Ava 3 weeks after Noah's visit. She picked up on the fourth ring. She said nothing. He could hear her breathing, waiting. He said her name. He said he was sorry. And then, and this is the part that revealed everything still unresolved in him, he said, "I just want you to know I'm willing to talk about it." Ava was quiet for a moment. "You want me to make this easier for you," she said. He started to say that wasn't what he meant. "You want me to say it's okay, so that you can feel like a father again without having done the work of becoming one." Her voice was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was finished. "I can't do that for you, Dad. I couldn't do it before. I definitely can't do it now." She hung up. Michael sat with the phone in his hand. "So now the question is in front of you, and it doesn't resolve neatly, and it shouldn't." Ryan used silence as a weapon. He spent a year cultivating Michael's trust specifically by corroding Ava's. He knew exactly what was at stake for himself when the test appeared, and he chose himself without a visible second of hesitation. He has not called Ava. He has not called Michael to confess. He is somewhere with his business opportunity and his untouched conscience. Laura saw. She saw enough. She made 13 small choices over 8 months that each felt minor individually and collectively meant that her daughter was alone. She wept at the door and did not move. Michael made the final call. He held the evidence and delivered the sentence and did not look at his daughter as she left. He had been told, in every form Ava could manage, that something was wrong. He chose Ryan's version every time. He picked up that test and had the ugliest possible thought about his own child and acted on it before asking a single question. Who is most responsible? The man with the power who used it. The one who engineered the collapse from a comfortable distance. The one who watched from close enough to stop it. There's no clean answer. That's the point. Ava had all 3 of them, and she still wound up alone. He found it on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the call she'd ended early. He was going through her room. Not to pack it away, he told himself that wasn't what it was. He started at the desk because habit is a powerful misdirection, because sometimes the hands go to things the mind isn't ready for. Bottom drawer. Under a journal, under a phone charger she'd left behind. A piece of paper, folded into quarters. Soft at the creases in the specific way of something that has been folded and unfolded many times by the same hands. He opened it. Her handwriting. Small. Careful. Precise, the same way it had been at 7 years old, at 12, at 16. The handwriting of someone who learned early to be deliberate about the space she took up. It was addressed to him, dated 11 months before that Tuesday night. It began, "Dad, I need to tell you something about Ryan, and I know the hardest part of this letter is the part where you believe me." She had written 4 paragraphs, measured, careful, afraid in the way only someone describing something real is afraid, not dramatized, not seeking sympathy, just trying to find exact words for something that resisted exactness. She described what was wrong. She described what she needed. She asked him directly, with the full exposure of someone who has no remaining strategy, to trust her over Ryan. She had not sent it. He could see why. He could see it in the phrasing, how many times it had been revised, crossed out, started over, how much work she had done to make the request impossible to dismiss, how she had run out of language for it anyway, not because the language didn't exist, because she already knew, somewhere below the place where hope lives, who would read it and what he would do. At the very bottom, in different ink, darker, pressed harder, written on a later day, she had added one line. "I already know what you'll choose." She had folded it, put it in the drawer, gone back to locking her door. Fewer dinners, shorter appearances, the existence of someone making herself smaller in increments, waiting for the thing she had already predicted. He had given her 11 months of evidence for that prediction, and when the moment came, he had confirmed it in the space of one glance and 4 words. Michael stood in his daughter's empty room for a long time. He held the letter the way he had held the test, with 2 fingers, at a small distance, like something he was not sure how to put down. The test had been wrong. The letter was not. Ava had understood her father clearly, completely, and 11 months in advance. She had written it down. She had almost given it to him. And then she had decided, quietly, finally, without drama, that the risk was not worth taking. Not because she didn't love him, because she already knew he didn't love her in the way that would have made any of this impossible. She had stayed 11 months after writing that line, let herself be talked about, dismissed, explained away. She stayed because leaving felt like giving up, and staying felt like proof she still believed in something. He had made her leave anyway. The man who would never have recognized himself in that letter finally read it in the silence of a room she no longer lived in, and understood at last that his daughter had seen him, clearly, without illusion, without protection, long before he had ever once truly looked at her. And she had already forgiven herself for knowing.